Today I'm joined by Irshaad Kathrada. Thank you very much for coming in studio with me and having a conversation about your life and your journey to where you are today. So I want to just take a step back and go back to the beginning. If you can tell me a little bit about your schooling career and your journey there.
Amazing. Well, Candice, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about this and that journey. So where do I begin? Cape Town, born and bred. Did all of my schooling here in Cape Town. Started off, I like to go back to the sort of the primary school, the nursery school days as well. I went to a school called Christopher Robin, which was like a beautiful little school in Greenpoint in Cape Town. And it was renowned at the time, this is late 80s, early 90s, as one of the few mixed-race schools at the time. So if you go back to the late 80s when I started my schooling, it was still sort of the apartheid days and many schools were still segregated. But increasingly, a number of private schools were opening up their doors to kids of all races, colors, and creeds. And so my parents were really keen to send me to one of these multi-ethnic, multicultural schools. I think there was a time when things were starting to change in South Africa and we were starting to get a sense that things were moving in the right direction and the world was opening up. So they were very, very keen. And then from there, I went to Western Province Prep, which is a private school here in Cape Town. Amazingly quaint, really beautiful school in the southern suburbs.
Did you play any rugby there?
Played rugby there very reluctantly in the beginning, but really got into it as things went on.
I love it. I think they breed children very differently in the Western Cape, where rugby with no shoes on.
Oh my gosh.
In the cold.
Yep.
I've seen that with my kids growing up. It's amazing.
I spent many a Saturday morning covered in mud, in the cold, running around. And it was really, really good. As I say, I was somewhat reluctant to get into rugby in the beginning. I wasn't the biggest kid growing up.
Hopefully the fastest.
I got a little quicker as I got a bit older. And then when others went through their growth spurts, probably I wasn't as quick anymore.
Yeah.
But I had a good bit of rugby playing days when I turned about 11, 12. Started playing for the A team because I was reasonably quick, and then everyone caught up with me, and then I dropped down the ranks there afterwards. But it was really good. And I think going to schools where there is a requirement to play sport after school is really important, because I think for a lot of kids, they wouldn't necessarily get into that. They wouldn't necessarily do it. And maybe parents wouldn't know to, encourage their kids to do that. But I think it's a really important thing from a team building, character building perspective. I learned a lot of life on the rugby field.
See those principles of time management as well at such a young age.
Absolutely. I came from a big cricketing family. My dad represented the South African Indian team back in the day. So he played cricket. And so a lot of life lessons were taught to me through cricket, particularly batting, patience, waiting it out. My dad would often say that, when you open the batting, the first 10 overs is about survival and thereafter it's about dominance. And I think back to that as a lesson for many, many things. When you're stepping into anything, you have to figure out kind of how the ball is moving, how the wicket is playing. Yeah. And thereafterwards, once you've got the lay of the land, you can move on. So I take that into everything, from work to other endeavors as well.
And then high school into varsity?
Yeah, so high school went to Bishops here in Cape Town. An incredible school, a great school. Learned a lot.
Academics, how were your academics at high school?
Yeah, always fairly strong. I'd say top 10, generally speaking, academically at school. I really enjoyed it. I had wide interests in terms of the subject matter that I did. I really enjoyed your English, your languages. I did French all the way through to matric. I did science, history. Really, really enjoyed that.
Can you speak French now?
Terribly, and with a lot of mistakes and with deep embarrassment when I do open my mouth. But learning French did give me a good segue into learning other languages, and somehow I've ended up a slightly better Spanish speaker than I'm a French speaker. I've traveled a lot in Spanish-speaking countries, so really enjoy it.
Amazing. And then choosing a university, obviously we've got some incredible universities in South Africa. We've got obviously UCT and Stellenbosch. Which one did you decide on?
So UCT, and there wasn't really ever a doubt in my mind. I only applied to one university. I applied to UCT. My dad had gone to UCT, and so I grew up thinking I was going to become an Ike. And my dad would always be, it's Ike versus Marty's.
Yes.
And he lectured, he was a cardiologist, a doctor. So he lectured at the University of Stellenbosch. But for whatever reason, UCT just seemed like it was the best option, and really glad that I went there.
What did you study there?
I'd say I took the scenic route through university,
Okay.
and that means I took a little bit of twists and turns along the way. So I started off in engineering. Coming from a medical family, there was a lot of pressure to become a doctor, and that's what my dad wanted me to do. I did not want to be a doctor, and so the compromise was becoming an engineer, which I managed to do for about a year. I enjoyed the maths, I enjoyed the physics, didn't quite enjoy the engineering. I went in and did mechanical engineering. Realized I didn't quite have the love for tinkering with things, but I really enjoyed kind of understanding the theoretical background. But after about a year, I decided to do a complete change of direction, and I started studying politics, history, and French.
Wow.
So I went and ended up in Bachelor of Social Science. And I did that for about 4 months, then actually dropped out of university completely. In part because I had a scholarship in my first year, didn't do as well in my first year as I wanted to, and ended up losing my scholarship. And I think with the move to social science, my dad wasn't overly happy with that, and he said to me, "Well, if that's what you want to do, figure out your own way, pay for it your own way," which I wasn't really able to do initially. And so I actually ended up dropping out, spending quite a bit of time thinking through what is it that I wanted to do.
What did you do in that time?
A lot of different things. So I studied English as a foreign language, and so I taught that. There was a little school close to the waterfront called In Lingua that had students from all over the world, which was really great for me as a 19-year-old to kind of get that exposure. They had a program for sort of refugees from across Africa, so lots of Congolese, Cameroonians, and others, and I taught them for a while. But I had a class of South Koreans, Japanese, Czechs, Germans arranged, and so that was really, really great. I taught the conversion course for one of the technicons. They had a group of Chinese kids that had come, and so they were needing to learn English, and so I taught that, which was really great. It was quite funny. I had to lie about my age because they didn't really... I feared that being taught by a 19-year-old might seem like, what does this guy have to teach me? So I remember saying to them that I was born 3 years earlier than I was to get through. And then it was actually in that year, my dad passed away. And that was actually quite a kind of a big moment for me in terms of thinking through what is it that I actually want to do with my life. And I decided to go back to University of Cape Town the next year, and I studied business science, which is what I ended with. So I ended up with a business science in finance, did my honors in finance, but also majored in economics and statistics while I was there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So quite a transition from
massive.
politics.
Massive. So I ended up in 3 different faculties while I was at the university, but each of them gave me their own little snippets of insights into different worlds, which I kind of carried through me into other courses that I did, but then also into work.
So obviously that doesn't pay the bills
No.
to study. You need to find a job and start something.
Mm-hmm.
Soon after varsity, you did start a small business. Do you want to talk through that?
Well, actually, before I started the business, I went into banking. So during my time in university, I had a small business, but it was, so when my folks passed away, I inherited a home, a 4-bedroom home in the Boekap in Cape Town. And I turned that into a little B&B, and I ran that for most of the time that I was in university. So that was my first kind of insight into what it was like to run a business.
Did you do that alone, or do you have siblings that you did that with?
No, so no siblings, only child. I did have a girlfriend at the time who was incredibly supportive, and we kind of ran it together. And it was full sort of board and lodge. We made dinners in the evenings for folks, rented out the rooms. Many of the people that we had staying with us were from the language school that we had previously taught at. So they were looking for that home immersion type of experience, and we provided that to them. But it was really interesting. It was actually during a time, so 2005-06, when the South African Rand was actually quite strong. And so students who were coming to South Africa to learn English were also looking at other parts of the world. They were looking at Malta, they were looking at going to Australia, they were looking at going to England. And at times, South Africa wasn't the cheapest place to come. And the tourists we had sort of dried up and it gave me sort of real insights into managing a business when you're exposed to currency risk, which was really, really great. But coming out of that experience, I did decide, look, I wanted to get into a company that gave me the opportunity to travel. And so straight out of university, I joined the US investment bank, JP Morgan. I worked for about 1 year in South Africa. It was about 2008, and it was the emergence of the financial crisis, as you'll recall. And so the division that I worked in, which was very focused on managing credit risk in South Africa and across the continent, eventually got wound up, and a number of us moved to the UK. So I ended up moving to the UK in late 2008, and got stationed there, and eventually ended up in a part of the bank that does restructurings of debt positions. So during the leverage finance boom of 2004, 5, and 6, JP Morgan had lent a bunch of money to different institutions. Much of those institutions couldn't pay back those loans, and so we ended up having a lot of these debt positions that were impaired. Some of them got turned into equity. We'd managed them like equity, and so it was a really interesting place. I mean, I ended up doing restructurings of Portuguese banks, Icelandic banks, Greek telecoms companies. Incredible. There was a South African cement company in there that we did a bit of work for. Yeah, it was incredible, really incredible to get that exposure, that learning. And I think what I liked about JPM, and it was a great place to start my career, is that it's a big institution with so much to learn that every few months there's a new challenge that you can put in front of yourself to try and get your head around. So when I first joined, I mean, the big thing was just getting my head around a set of financials. And so, probably in my first year that I was there, I looked at the financial statements of, if I say 200 companies, I wouldn't be exaggerating, from manufacturing businesses to financial services businesses, commodities, a whole range of different things. And that was just a great place to go to school, because all of a sudden you start to get your sense of, okay, well, these are what margins look like in these type of industries. This is what valuations look like. These are how volatile cash flows might be. But then the next step was fantastic. You've got your head around financial statements. Now get your head around negotiating a legal agreement. And that was really good. Get your head around negotiating a sale of equity or a sale of debt or a conversion thereof. And I think it was an amazing space to kind of get a great insight into how global capital works, how global finance works. I think being based in London gave me a great opportunity to travel in part around the continent. It wasn't always the easiest because I had a South African passport. So, as you know, getting visas isn't the easiest thing a lot of the time. So I had to miss out on some of the opportunities. But then from there, having spent about 3.5 years in London, I got the opportunity to move to New York, which was great. So the head office for the bank, and I ended up spending about 5 years there. Initially, I joined the leverage finance team in New York, trying to look at, there was an expectation that there'd be a massive boom coming out of the financial crisis, particularly in natural resources. Didn't quite pan out the way we thought. And so within a year of that, I ended up moving to a part of the bank that invests the bank's own capital, called the Chief Investment Office. We had about $350 billion under management, a mostly credit portfolio, very focused in the United States. And so my job was effectively credit strategy. So both, analyzing the credit risk on new investment opportunities and then managing there afterwards. There was a massive change in the regulatory framework in the United States coming out of the financial crisis. It meant that banks couldn't really rely on the rating agencies the way they had done. And so we had to build all of that capacity internally. So one of my first jobs was coming in and providing a rating on 15,000 individual investments that we had. And we had to pull that off in 3 months. And so there was a lot of sleepless nights. We were building a team from scratch, but it was an amazing opportunity. I really enjoyed.
I think going back to some of those experiences and just the learnings there, I do find that, young entrepreneurs don't understand financial statements. They don't understand legal agreements. So you got incredible experience, I think, for the next phases in your career and your journey.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to get that schooling somewhere, somehow. I mean, you can get it as an entrepreneur, but again, you may not get that sort of scale. And I was thinking back to that experience in JP Morgan. I mean, in the end, I was there for 9 years. And there was never a dull moment, and there was never a lack of learning opportunities. And I think what's great about some of these larger companies, and certainly at the time when I joined, is that training was a big part of the ethos of developing talent. And so you came in, and I remember even here in the Johannesburg office, the first 3 weeks we were there, we didn't get into the job. We had dedicated training where they would bring in financial service professionals, people that had worked for so many years, and give us that sort of very rigorous understanding of the language of finance, the tools of finance. I mean, we even got coached on communication and public speaking and how to get your point across. And
Yeah, all the more softer skills.
Exactly, which is really great.
How amazing. Did you have a mentor during that time?
I had several mentors within the organization. I think mentorship was something that certainly JPM was big on. And so starting off, I think most of the grads getting in would be assigned someone who they could turn to. But over time, you sort of develop informal mentors as well. And, actually that move that I did across to New York and then into the chief investment office, I was brought along by a senior guy who I'd built a relationship with, a guy called Nick Conran, an Australian. And we sort of connected on the fact that we were Antipodeans, connected on cricket and rugby and, anyone but England type of approach, which a lot of South Africans and Australians have, particularly in the UK.
I hope you messaged him about the results of cricket.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Indeed. I made him aware that I'm still keeping a good eye on what's going on with the Test series. And yeah, I think it was really important to have that, because I think without someone looking after you in these large organizations, you can sometimes get lost. And so you've got to hitch your wagon to a bit of a star. And I was lucky in that I made the right choices, found the right people who were prepared to bat for me, support me along the journey. And that allowed me to, get to New York. And getting to New York wasn't by luck or by chance. I mean, every time anyone asked me about what my long-term plans were and my trajectory, I said, I want to go to New York. I want to work in the head office. I want to be there. And it had been something, I think for multiple reasons, I wanted to get to New York. I mean, in South Africa, you grow up with the sense that New York is the center of the world, and in many cases it is. And you grow up with so much US television and culture that makes it look like the most amazing place in the world, which in many respects it is. But actually, when I started JPM, all of the analysts from across the world, whether you started your career in Johannesburg, Kazakhstan, Singapore, Buenos Aires, you all got brought into New York for a 2-month training session. Wow. And so we got kind of let run wild in the streets of New York with a little bit of a stipend. And it was there and then that I realized I really want to give this a go at some point in my career.
It's such a busy place.
Yeah.
How do you take time to just get away from the noise and settle your mind?
I found Central Park was such a beautiful space for that. And there are parts of the park where if you go there at the right time of year, there's a part called the Rambles, and it's called the Rambles because it just grows incredibly thick. And, but for the siren in the distance and maybe a car hooter, you can actually feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And I really appreciated that about New York. But actually, it's really easy to just jump on the train, go north for about an hour and a half, and all of a sudden you're kind of in the Hudson River Valley with great hiking. Skiing is only 3.5 hours away to Vermont. And so I was kind of part of a group of friends that really took the opportunity and the time to just get out of the city as much as possible. So the city offers you things, but you have to be quite intentional about getting out. Because as you say, it can be kind of suck you in and
it's
you get
very loud and there's a lot happening.
Absolutely.
So 9 years in investment banking. Where did that journey then end?
Yeah, so eventually I got to the point where I had to kind of really look at where I wanted to take my career. I'd got to the level of executive director, which is sort of one rung down from managing director. And, I'd been advised that I was on the track to get to managing director. It was something that they could see happening to me at that stage, within 2 years. And I was in my early 30s at that point. So I was relatively young for an executive director at JPM. And I had to think, is this what I wanted to do long term? And at this point, I hadn't really worked much, certainly as an adult in South Africa. And I went through a process actually thinking about it quite deeply. In fact, even in the context of therapy, thought about where do I want to spend my time? What do I want to do with my life? What is my life's mission?
In those 9 years, had you returned to South Africa?
I had, but generally just for vacations, nothing ever longer than a few weeks, a month at most.
And did you feel there was something pulling you back to South Africa?
Definitely. And I think part of it was, if you look at where do you want to apply yourself, what is the change you want to be part of? I could do it in New York, I could do it in the States, but they aren't my problems and they aren't my challenges in the sense that I'm not an American. And I wanted to come back to South Africa and genuinely be part of the solution. We have all of the challenges, we know them. I think everyone in this country can rattle off, 1,000 different things that are wrong, but what we need are more people that have taken those learnings from across the world and bring them back and see how do we apply them to South Africa. And I wanted to be part of that. So having spent that time, I moved back to South Africa, and this is where I started my first primary business, which was called Slide, still is. And the intention that we had was to bring back a solution that we had seen in the United States called Venmo. So Venmo is a business which is owned by PayPal. And what they had built was a mobile peer-to-peer payment system. And it was actually quite interesting. When I got to the United States, people were still writing checks to each other.
Yeah.
I actually had to Google, how do you write a check? Because at some point in my schooling, someone had taught me how to do it, but I'd forgotten because, of course,
how to check.
You never do it here in South Africa. Everything's with EFTs, credit cards. And so it was quite fascinating to get to the States and realize that to some extent, banking is a little bit behind what the typical person here would experience. And so Venmo was introduced, and all of a sudden it revolutionized payments. And within a couple of years, they went to about $30 billion in transactions flowing across the platform. And so my friends and I, all of us were South African, all of us had lived in the States. All of us came back to South Africa around about the same time with an intention to start a business. And we thought to ourselves, it was actually, as these things often are, we were sitting on the beach one day, and my friend Alon had brought some drinks, and I was like, oh man, I should get you back for the drinks. And I was like, wait, how do I get you back? I wish I could just Venmo you.
Yeah.
And it was sort of in that moment, literally sitting on the beach, the 2nd of January in Cape Town, where we said to ourselves, should we just try and build it? So we did. So, over that summer, I had met people at Barclays Rise, which was a incubator based here in Cape Town. I pitched it to the person who was running it. She liked it. She thought, that's great. Why don't you come work in our space? We'll let you work here for free. We've got a whole bunch of different startups, SMEs that are doing all sorts of things. Maybe you'll find people that can build this with you. And so we found 1 or 2 complementary startups who provided us some of the kind of services that we'd need, particularly around, managing ledgers, payments, integration of payments, APIs. We built it all within a period of 3 to 4 months. And so from the concept, deciding that we were going to do it on the 2nd of January, we launched the app on the 15th of September of that same year. We built very, very quickly, and there were just 3 of us, and we built it ourselves. And, my job coming in, my friend Alon, as I mentioned, had done his PhD at NYU, could code anything. Terence, who was our co-founder as well, had spent time in Silicon Valley. And so between the 2 of them, they could build both the back end and the front end. And my job was to try and, register the company, build the bank accounts, build the relationships with suppliers, try and get our first customers. And so
ensure your financial statements and everything,
all of that good stuff,
submissions were done,
write the policies. Exactly. And it was such a funny thing, because we went through this period, and I don't even know if this is a word, but of corporatizing the business, turning what was a concept and an idea into something that was real. And it was something as simple as coming to meetings wearing a shirt. Yes, of course, you can come wearing shorts and T-shirt and you can still do the work. But I just felt it was really important. I remember Alon saying to me afterwards, he thought it was so strange that I'd come to meetings wearing a shirt, but afterwards he realized it was the right tone to set. We came up with a color scheme. If I did a presentation, even just the 2 of them, I'd make sure that it was on our kind of agreed deck with our agreed fonts and all of these different things.
Do you think that was learnings from your JP Morgan days?
100%. Because I think being at an institution like that gives you a sense of this is how you do things.
This is structure.
This is structure.
How you grow things and scale
Absolutely.
things.
Absolutely. You have to bring rigor. You have to bring a
sense of professionalism.
Exactly. And I think we did that, and that allowed us to kind of get to that point where we built the business. And so initially what we wanted to do was to build it as a peer-to-peer payment platform. But it was really insightful kind of going through that journey, because it was a nice idea, and everyone we spoke to thought, okay, it's nice, it's good. But what I realized that the problem we were solving for was not as big as, say, what Venmo solved for in the United States. Sending money from person to person in the US was an absolute pain. Having to write a check was a pain. It would cost you money. So they were producing a solution to a problem which was big enough for people to want to resolve. And it wasn't the case in South Africa, because our banking system was a little bit more advanced, because we had things like cash send and instant money, which are embedded in the FNB app or the Standard Bank app, which has a lot of traction, a lot of usage. While what we were providing was interesting and nice because it integrated with all of the apps, and it didn't matter whether you banked with Standard Bank or Investec or whatever, the it wasn't a big enough solution to a big enough problem.
And I think if you look at our demographic, majority of the population probably carry cash.
Yeah.
And what would be great is that transition into have your bank accounts, then be able to use this to pay people.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what we were trying to do is go after the unbanked portion of the population, because what we thought to ourselves is, well, it would be amazing if we could create a platform where people could go to a PEP or a Boxer or a USave in any part of the country and collect the cash. But the app would effectively be the platform through which money would get sent. And because we were providing this digital platform where payments could be settled instantaneously, because we managed to kind of design effectively this cash float where money was moving across instantaneously, it could help. And actually, we ended up in fairly deep conversations with a group called Star Africa, which was part of then the PEP group, around whether or not we could integrate into their system. In the end, we decided not to go ahead with the deal because it wasn't the right valuations for us, etc. But yeah, again, the sort of the use case wasn't quite there for what we were trying to do. And so we ended up pivoting. And where we pivoted to was providing closed wallet solutions to institutions. And now, in particular, this, the Pay and Connect mobile money platform at the University of Cape Town is running off the back of what we built. Wow. And that's been a really great sort of thing. And so, I'm no longer operational in the company. I'm a minority shareholder, but my co-founder Terence is still there. And
how many employees is there?
So it's relatively small, still less than 10. But with those less than 10, they're able to provide all of the kind of services that the University of Cape Town. So effectively, all of the mobile wallet transactions, from meal vouchers that flow on campus to payments in the bookstore, etc., flow through the Pay and Connect app at the university.
So I think you scaled a business that you could probably sell because you didn't need to be operationally involved in that. So you then stepped away. What was the next step in your journey?
So the next step was joining the South African government, which was not something I'd initially thought I would do. Coming back to South Africa, I didn't have any real intention.
Tell me how that happens.
Yeah.
So running your own business, was there a conversation had? Did someone pick up the phone? How do you actually get into government?
So I didn't come through the regular route that a lot of people would do. A lot of people
almost
kind of
like
join
your university career.
Yeah, a little bit. I took a slightly different route. So where it actually began, and when I was at the University of Cape Town, I was still in my second or third year. I did an internship at the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union. And so, I came in and did some work, putting all of their data into nice Excel spreadsheets and pivots and doing things that were quite, with the training that I had, were quite easy to do. And I had I created a bit of a relationship with the General Secretary, a guy, Ibrahim Patel, who went on to become the Minister of Economic Development in 2009. And we kind of kept in touch with each other over the years. And so when I moved to the UK, he came over, we caught up for coffee and we talked about my career. He came over to New York when I was there. And again, we caught up for dinner and it was actually quite cool. He took me for dinner at the home of Joseph Stiglitz. So
Yes.
He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. And Joseph Stiglitz and I got to chat about banking and the global economy. Wow. And I think, Minister Patel got to see that actually I could hold my own in these type of conversations. And so when I moved back to South Africa, he said to me, look, I need capacity. I need smart people to join. I know that you haven't come through a public policy route, but that doesn't matter. I know with the skill set that you've acquired with your time in banking, you'd be able to come in and do a job. And I was initially a little bit reluctant to join the government. It was 2017. It was the back end of the Zuma years. I wasn't really sure what to expect. But with the ANC elective conference at the end of 2017, Cyril Ramaphosa becomes the ANC president. It's now looking that like a new version of government will come in.
And we all felt that. We all felt like, oh my gosh, Cyril's coming in.
Absolutely.
South Africa is going to change.
South Africa is going to change, is changing. And we can talk a little bit about what has changed and what hasn't. But About a week after Ramaphosa steps up, gives his first State of the Nation address, I joined the South African government. And, I really felt it when he stood up in Parliament and he said, Tumamina, send me. I was like, yeah, absolutely. This is what I came home for. I came home to be part of the solution, part of addressing the problems of our country. Let me do this. So I came in as what's referred to as a special advisor to the minister. And so every minister has the opportunity to appoint who they want, their team of, what they call chief of staffs, parliamentary advisors, and a special advisor. And different ministers use their special advisors in different ways. Some special advisors will have very specific knowledge on a particular area that's relevant to the portfolio. I came in as someone who just knew how to execute, knew how to get things done. And so I got deployed in a whole range of different areas from, managing the new legislation that was going through Parliament, through government. And initially, actually, when I came in 2018, there was only about 18 months left to the end of the administration, till the next election, which was mid-2019. And I'd sort of given my commitment, look, I'll do this period. I'll give you this 18 months. I'm not sure that I'm here to stay for the long haul. And so I came in with the sense of, look, we've got a job to do. Let's get it done. And in that year and a half, there was new legislation that came through Parliament. So it was the new Competition Amendment Act that made it through. And, I played a role in shepherding it through all the various parliamentary committees that it needed to go through, getting the buy-in from various stakeholders, from business to labor to civil society, engaged at NEDLAC as a forum in South Africa. It was incredible. And actually, at the time, it was the piece of legislation that went from introduction to signing faster than any other piece of legislation in the country. And that was an incredible bit of work. It was flying up and down across the country. You have a meeting in the morning in Cape Town, a meeting in the afternoon in Johannesburg, and back again. And so it was incredible.
I wanted to actually touch on that because obviously you only had 18 months that you had given and committed your time. You were great at execution. Things get done quickly. How did you feel coming into government where we know there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of policy that has to go through approvals? You just say this one went through really quickly. How did you manage that? Why do you think that was different to other policies that have been, extended for years and years and haven't been finalized yet?
I think part of it was we had a very focused game plan. We sat early days and mapped out the entire process. And I think this was part of both the minister having a vision for what he wanted to achieve and how we needed to do it, but then having a team, including myself and others. So I don't want to in any way take credit for this and say I did everything, but we had a team that was prepared to one, map out what was required, understand where the potential roadblocks would be, note what are the various pieces of support we would need to mobilize within the broader society, and to be very clear on what we needed to do. And I think that at time, first of all, going into government from having been, first of all, in a large private sector company to then being in a very small startup was incredibly eye-opening. I think like many South Africans who sit on the outside, I was very critical of government. I had lots of opinions about how slow things are, how everything could be done better. And if I was going to go into government, I was going to, improve everything. It was incredibly humbling going into government because you realize just how complex everything is. And every single piece of policy will have those parts of society that will be positively influenced by it, and that will have those that are negatively influenced. And what you hope is that in producing any piece of policy, you've weighed up and you've balanced both the positives and the negatives. And on the balance of that cost-benefit analysis, you're making the decision that is more in the interest of society than less, right? That's what you hope happens. Now, while everyone can understand the theory and the framework around what's to do it, actually collecting the information that you might require is very difficult, because everyone you speak to will tell you why their problems are most profound and why any piece of policy needs to speak more to their problems than to someone else's. And so there's an extensive period of consultation that you need to go through. And I think that's one thing that I learned, that for better or for worse, being a constitutional democracy, South Africa has to consult widely. And we have an incredibly fragmented society. part of that is an overhang from the days of apartheid and colonialism, where you have different parts of the country that have developed at different rates, that have different interests. But you can't produce a piece of policy that's good for Sandton and not good for Lusikisiki in the Eastern Cape, or Calvinia in the Northern Cape. Like, there have to be congruencies across all of it, and you have to produce a piece of policy that can speak to the needs of every person in society. And I think that is the big challenge that we have in South Africa and in our democracy. So it was a huge lesson, but nonetheless, I think we mobilized the team that would address the issues, mitigate what we could mitigate, accept that there were things that we couldn't mitigate, be very crystal clear as crystal clear as we could be about where the challenges were, what we sought to mitigate. And I think eventually we ended up with a piece of policy that, obviously everything now comes down to implementation, but introduced a lot of sensible elements that we needed in South Africa that we didn't previously have. And I think, we obviously the proof will be now in the way that sort of gets rolled out by the various regulatory bodies. But it was a really interesting piece of work to be involved in. And, other things we did in that 18 months, the president decided he wanted to have an investment conference.
Yeah.
So the first one was hosted in 2018, and our department became the line department, the line ministry that organized it. And that was incredible as well. I mean, the investment conference, a lot has been said about, are they new investments? Are they not? And look, I think what we wanted was, we had come out of a number of years where there was certainly a sense that there was no investment happening in South Africa. And what we wanted to show that, well, there are pockets of investment that's happening. And what we want to do is, by creating a showpiece around investment over a period of 5 years, it will force the parts of government to align themselves in such a way that investment promotion becomes a key focus. It was a big part of what the president wanted to do. And I think there were certainly challenges in how it was rolled out, but I do think there's a lot of investment that probably did come about because of having this showpiece. But, a big part of the job was trying to understand, okay, who is on the precipice or on the cusp of making an investment in South Africa, but what are the big challenges that they're facing at the moment, be it from, municipal issues like water use licenses, et cetera, to there might be big policy issues that they have, and trying to see what of those could you reasonably address in that space of time.
Because I think a lot of people come into South Africa thinking, okay, well, business as usual, but it takes time.
It really does.
And being able to implement, certain policies does take time. So it is frustrating for a lot of international clients who come and set up shop in South Africa. They don't understand why it's taking so long to register a company and get the things off the ground. In your time in government, did you have any opportunity with that private public partnership? Was there any learnings from that perspective?
So I think a big thing that happened sort of with the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa is there were a couple of initiatives that were set up. Yeah. So one was what was referred to as the PPGI, which was the Public-Private Growth Initiative, which was set up, which sort of brought in stakeholders from the private sector and government to think through what are the big challenges and what can the private sector do, what can government do, and then also bringing in what we call other social partners, so organized labor, civil society, to try and figure out what the role is for each one of these stakeholders and role players. So yeah, look, had a lot of exposure to that. It isn't without its challenges. So I think that's the big thing that I've learned through this process is South Africa's problems are real, our challenges are real, and that there aren't any silver bullets and quick fixes to many of the deep problems that we have. Some of the things that we need to work through are the challenges of a generation. And I think what we have tried, what government has tried to create is at least the platforms for coordination, collaboration, filtering through insights. But I think, again, back to the point that the challenges of the country are diverse. You've got to be listening to business as much as you need to be listening to ordinary South Africans who might feel that their interests aren't well addressed by the private sector in many different respects. And so it's having to
There's
navigate.
so many nuances that you need to consider.
There
And
really
I think
are.
even as an outsider, you can criticize governments as much as you like, because you don't see it as fast-paced as maybe, when you're running a business and decisions get made quickly. But I understand there's a lot of intricacies there that need to be considered. So did you stay longer than 18 months?
I did. So I ended up staying beyond the election, and that ran us into the COVID period, which was a crazy time to be in government. And so the new administration, if we just recall, the election was in May 2019. Typically by about June, the new ministries are assembled. And so what happened was the old Department of Economic Development, or Economic Development Department, and the old Department of Trade and Industry got merged into what was called a super economic ministry, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And so that, we again began there. And I was always unsure whether this was going to be a long-term sort of journey for me, but nonetheless, I sort of stuck with it. And then COVID hits by March of 2020, and that just changed all of those wonderful plans of action we had and focused everyone's attention on that, which became really the focus of government for the next 2 years. But after having gone through that period, I was quite exhausted.
Can you imagine?
Because we were the line ministry that was responsible in many ways for thinking through not only the initial lockdown, but then that phased reopening of the economy. And I think there was certainly broad support amongst many South Africans for that initial part of the lockdown. I think locking down early for that first 3 weeks generally understood that. It got extended to 6 weeks, started to lose a little bit of support. People were like, do we really need this? But then that phased period that we went through after that initial 6 weeks, as we went from, I don't know if you recall, we had these different lockdown levels, level 5, level 4, level 3. And part of what our ministry was responsible for doing was trying to help the decision makers think through which parts of the economy could open. And it was fascinating, because what I realized at that point is that we were having to learn in real time actually how intricate the economy is. And I remember one conversation we had very early days where there was an appreciation, certainly by the police and other parts of government, that fine, retail stores that provide groceries, they should stay open because people need to buy food. Fantastic. But then if you think about it, well, how does a retail store stock itself? You need to have delivery. So the delivery trucks need to be operating. And then the distribution centers need to be operating. And then the farms need to be operating. And the ports need to be operating. So when you realize there's actually a lot of interconnectedness and intricacy in the South African economy that I don't think was broadly appreciated, certainly beyond maybe a small sector of society that understood that. And so bringing that insight into how we locked down and then reopened the economy was fascinating to kind of be on the inside. I mean, it left all of us completely ragged. And so by June 2021, I was quite exhausted. And it was at that point that I decided to take a bit of a sabbatical. So I went from being full-time in the government to then ending up at the University of Oxford. Initially not to study. I followed my wife. She wanted to do her MBA. Well, my then fiance, I should say, now wife. But she, from the day I met her, she was strongly focused on getting her MBA, particularly at a university like the University of Oxford. So off we went. And so initially my intention was to work part-time, which I continued to do. So I was still doing some advisory work in the ministry, but things that I could do from abroad. So working on some policy documents and that kind of thing. But that time in Oxford was really quite incredible. And I have to say life-changing, because having seen what she was going through and then having had that opportunity to step away, I decided to study myself. So in the second year that we were there, I did a master's in sustainability, enterprise, and the environment, which is very different from anything I had done previously.
How did you choose that? Why did you choose that?
It's a good question. So there are a couple of reasons. When I was still in government, we were doing some work with the automotive industry. And South Africa actually has the largest automotive manufacturing industry on the continent, and we're in the top 20 globally. So, we're producing about 600,000 cars, but most of what we produce in South Africa is exported to other countries, and in particular Europe and the UK. Europe had introduced, because of their European Green Deal, effectively a cutoff point at which internal combustion engines would be sold in the European Union. So effectively, any car run on petrol and diesel would no longer be sold and would have to be phased out for, at the very least, plug-in hybrids and potentially battery electric vehicles. And so we're faced with a bit of an existential crisis in South Africa as to how do we transition our own industry being from one that produces primarily internal combustion engines to one that does battery electric. And it's not so trivial as just saying, well, we're going to switch off the one and turn on the other tomorrow, because global supply chains, which take a long time to develop, have to be brought in.
And also just geographically, if I had to drive from Cape Town to Durban on a battery,
totally,
where am I charging stations?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the way that many other economies had done it is that they'd tried to develop a local EV market, and that local EV market provides substantial demand, which would allow a local manufacturing capacity to come alongside. But in South Africa, if you think about it, it's going to be a long time before we're driving EVs en masse in our country for many reasons. Like you say, charging infrastructure isn't there. The distances that typical South Africans are driving are much longer. The cost of an EV is significantly higher. And also, if you think about it, we're on, certainly then we were on a 80-90% coal-fired grid. Actually charging your EV with coal-fired generation doesn't reduce your emissions. So there wasn't actually a carbon benefit to it. In the long term, it does, but certainly in the short term, it doesn't. And so for various reasons, we had to think very differently about South Africa's automotive industry. So going then to my own choices, I realized that while I had this wonderful schooling in finance, this wonderful schooling now in public policy, I didn't really understand climate change. I think for like many people, we can all say, oh, the world's getting warmer. And as a result, climates are changing, and that's going to have some impact.
But how do you measure carbon
Exactly. How do you measure it? Which industries, which policies, what's happening around the world? And so I took some time to look at, what was happening in the job market. And I also started to see, if people were asking for consultants, they wanted them to have some ESG background or something like that. And so I thought, well, I'm here. It just so happened that Oxford had one of the best programs on sustainability, which many have referred to as sort of the MBA for sustainability. I hadn't at that point done my master's. It had always been something that I wanted to do. And so I applied, and luckily I got in and managed to get a scholarship as well, which was great, and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a really great proper MSc where there's a lot of coursework, nice big dissertation that you need to write at the end of it, the exams. And
it must be amazing to then, once you've got all that commercial experience behind you, to come back and actually just focus on your master's in something that you've chosen. You wake up, that is the focus. You don't have any other responsibilities necessarily. And you can actually just pay attention to that.
It was incredible. In many ways, it was like professional therapy, if you think about it. Because when you study climate change, you're studying the intersection of so many different things. You're studying history, you're studying politics, you're studying finance, you're studying public policy, and you're trying to say, well, how do we bring all of these different levers of society together in a way that we can manage a decarbonization agenda? And so, in a sense, it gave me an opportunity to look back at my own career with a very different lens, and with the sort of the kind of the rigors of being in a master's program. I mean, you can obviously do that in different ways, but I think being in a master's program like that, and a full-time one, gives you the opportunity and the space to look at it in so many different ways. And then, of course, when you're at a university like Oxford, you're with so many people studying so many different things, and the college system, which is very much like the house system in Hogwarts or something like that, is great because you'll be at dinner with people that are doing their DPhils or their PhDs in so many different and interesting things. I mean, I'd sit at a dinner table and someone doing some work on AI. There's someone else studying the fact that elephants and whales don't get cancer, and why is that, and what learnings do we have for humans? All
just
sorts of different
incredible minds. Hey?
Incredible
It almost makes you want to just go and do a whole bunch of things. You need to actually just focus on what you do.
Oh, absolutely. And every day there are talks that you can go to on a myriad of different things. You know, some hosted in the economics department or in the African studies department, just anything you can get your mind to. And in a way, it's almost overwhelming because you want to do everything. And then you realize, well, you can't do everything. You've got to choose. And sometimes you actually get tired and actually all you want to do is go out for dinner. But even going out for dinner was a stimulating experience with people from around the world. And I mean, my own course had people, I mean, I was one of the oldest, but I wasn't the oldest. And so I was sitting in a classroom in my late 30s. There were young 40-year-olds doing their masters. There were people fresh out of an undergrad. And so that in itself was great. I mean, representing 12 or 13 different countries from Asia, South America. I was the only African there. And so I had to feel, I felt like I had to represent the continent in some ways. But it was really, really great.
You can see how people just become students and want to just be in, because how do you leave that? How do you leave that energy? And that's, very, very, it's mind work and focus. And it's quite interesting. So
absolutely,
that your master's is now done.
Yep.
Your fiance or wife at the time, her MBA is done.
Absolutely.
Stay in the UK, come home. What happens there?
Yeah, we thought about it a little bit at the time, but I think still the pull back to South Africa was strong for various reasons. Look, again, professionally, it offers you a lot of opportunity. The quality of life, obviously, if you live on the right side of the divide, is fantastic. I mean, you can't beat Cape Town and places like that, but this whole country for its scenery. We both like to get outdoors, go hiking, camping. So I think there was still a strong pull. So she eventually came back, started working for McKinsey. Okay. I came back, finished off my time in the South African government, which took me up until the end of the last elections. Okay. And then I got called by an organization called the Localisation Support Fund and asked whether I'd be interested in joining. Can
we talk about that? So just how that fund was set up. And why it was set up. What is it all about?
Sure.
Tell me through that. And then we'll talk through some of the initiatives that run through that nonprofit organization.
Absolutely. So it was an initiative that was set up initially by private sector funders, Coca-Cola being the primary one. And where it came from is, under the competition legislation in South Africa, when there's a merger in the economy, the authorities need to look at both the impact of that merger on competition in the market, whether it's going to increase or lessen competition, but also something they call the public interest. How will this merger affect small businesses, employment, ownership in the economy? And so Coca-Cola had merged some of its bottling enterprises. And typically what happens is they'll come to government and say, look, we are merging these bottling enterprises. There may be a lessening of competition between them, but we think it's better for the public interest for the following reasons. And one of the things they said was, well, we really believe that we need to start supporting manufacturing in different ways. South Africa had a significant manufacturing economy representing 20% of our GDP, as recently as maybe 20, 25 years ago, but for various reasons. And it's not just a South African phenomenon, it is a global phenomenon that manufacturing has declined as a proportion of GDP, but it's happened much more steeply in South Africa. And that's a problem because manufacturing is often seen as the engine of the economy. I mean, there's a lot of literature from economics and finance that shows that for every one manufacturing job you create as many as 4 to 5 other jobs through the economy. In fact, it has the highest jobs multiplier of any sector in South Africa. But because we were losing manufacturing, or at least it was stagnant, we were losing all of these jobs and not benefiting from this real opportunity for a growth engine. And so the Localisation Support Fund was set up to provide some of the research, the technical support, and the advocacy that would be needed to better manufacturing in South Africa. And it was done in collaboration with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition as sort of the lead department focused on industrialization in South Africa, funded by the private sector. They set it up as a independent unit. It's a non-profit company. It's what's called a public benefit organization. And so that means that everything what we do is in the public benefit. We don't charge for any of these services. There's no sort of commercial interest in it for us. We're measured on the interventions that we do and whether or not that leads to any increased manufacturing in the South African economy, either through import replacement or through exports to markets that we weren't previously exporting to. And so in terms of, some of the work that we do everything from, industry research. So I'll give an example. Eskom, and now what's called the National Transmissions Company, will be investing in the transmissions infrastructure of South Africa over the next 10 years. They're going to build out 14,500 kilometers of new transmission infrastructure as we build out our energy grid. Now that's going to mean we're going to spend somewhere between 130, 140 billion rands. And the big question is, how do we use that money not only to effectively build out the grid, but to spur industrial activity, manufacturing activity? How do we use that spending to develop a steel industry, or to kind of in many ways bolster our steel industry? How do we use that to develop our transformer capability, our cabling? And so we did some research looking at, as you build out this infrastructure grid, what are the key componentry that are going to be in demand? Things like steel towers and transformers and cabling. And then where do we have the manufacturing capacity in South Africa, and where can we build that manufacturing capacity quite strongly? That then led us to another piece of work that we then did, looking at how cost competitive South African manufacturing is versus imports of steel towers, and at what point are we competitive? And it was really interesting. You find that as you build economies of scale, and I think anyone who's run a business and looked at the financials will know this, but as you build the economies of scale, prices do come down. Yeah. The question is there enough demand to substantiate the level of scale you need? And that's actually coming out of our study, something that we found. And now what we're doing is we're working with the National Transmissions Company on the implementation of their industrialization strategy. Okay. And that means, how do they make good decisions, within a framework of good governance and financial prudence, but still using the spending power to build manufacturing capacity in South Africa. So we try to provide that link between the manufacturing sector, the SOEs, and other parts of society as well. I mean, even in the private sector, we've worked with large FMCGs that have tried to localize some of their, inputs into manufacturing. And if you think about it, why would any business want to localize? There's this sort of, I'll call it a myth, because it's sort of treated as a general fact, which is not true, that imports are cheaper than local manufacturing. It's actually not true for in a lot of different areas. And one of the ways in which we see that imports aren't cheap is that, and this is something that's come out of the COVID crisis that we've gone through, is that lead times on imports have increased substantially. Yeah. So where you'd be able to get a good from China to South Africa within 3 months, it can now take 6, 8, sometimes 12 months, depending on what it is that you're trying to import. And that's not just because of issues at our own ports, it's issues just globally with global supply chains. And so speaking to a lot of businesses, they are keen to localize because it can help them with supply chain resilience. Yeah. Because the last thing you want is to find that you don't have access to the good. And if you don't have access to the good, which is the input to your manufacturing processes, your alternative, if lead times are long, is to run very high inventory balances, which means that you tie up a lot of capital in inventory. You can't redeploy that towards growth and other initiatives. And so through the work that we're doing, which is both research and, as I say, technical support, we're able to support local manufacturers in plugging in and scaling into these global FMCG supply chains.
How do you provide that support? What do you have round tables? What does that look like? And who can join this fund?
Absolutely. So anyone can apply to this fund, and hopefully when we put this out, we can get our email address out there. But it's the lsfsa.co.za. But anyone can apply to the fund, and the kind of support that we provide to private businesses includes industrial engineers, process engineers. What we really focused on is, how do we make South African manufacturing more competitive? Yeah. There's no point trying to redirect domestic demand towards local manufacturing if ultimately that local manufacturing is going to add cost. So what we want is, we want our local manufacturers to be producing both for the South African market and for exports, but we know that there's a competitiveness journey that they need to go on, particularly as they scale. And so, in different industries, there's sort of low-hanging fruit. We've done quite a lot of work in the clothing industry where identifying where the demand is with some of your major South African retailers, so the likes of the Fashini Group or Pick n Pay Clothing, Willie's Clothing, Mr. Price. We've done a bit of work where we've spoken to each of the retailers and tried to understand, based on where they see consumer trends going, based on their own supply chains, what are the product categories that they would like to localize? We then went to the manufacturing universe in South Africa and said, tell us what you can manufacture. We have manufacturers that are looking for goods. Let us know what your capabilities are. And then the next step is the matchmaking. Putting those list of manufacturers in front of the retailers and saying, well, you said you wanted to try and localize denims. Here are 3 South African manufacturers that can produce denims. The next part of the strategy is then to say, well, they may not be competitive today, but what can we do to help them be competitive? Yeah. How can we improve them on processes? And, there have been some companies that were loss-making for years that through the introduction of a process engineer went profit-making within a 4-month period.
So if I'm a member of your fund, I would then obviously join. Would you then come into my business and provide that sort of advice? So do you guys have a team that come in and just assess currently how I'm operating? These are my margins. This is what I look like. So from an economic perspective, and then introduce me to people. How does that relationship
Yeah, absolutely.
work?
So if we get an application, the first thing we do is a needs analysis. Because what we find often is, some of the applicants know they want to become competitive, but they haven't yet understood what are the areas of opportunity within their business. So within our own organization, which is relatively small, we try to keep it lean, but we have people with industrial engineering experience. I myself, obviously, with the finance background, will do a little bit of a needs analysis. We then bring in the third-party expertise that can do the work on a very focused assignment for a period of time. And with the change management that's required, I think that's the thing. But the big thing is, obviously, we want to be able to help every single company in South Africa if we could. We're not sitting on forever money, I like to say. And so the one thing we really focused on is we want to make sure that as we help companies, it's an unlock to industrial growth. And so we really are, big kind of thesis to how we work is focusing in on where the demand is in the South African economy and being able to then ensure that whatever manufacturing capacity is being built can satisfy that demand at the price point, quality, lead times that are required. And so we really do like to do what we call network orchestration. It's a big part of what we do, which is to say, yes, we can help you with your competitiveness, but actually what we want to try and do is plug you into some of the major sort of industries that we're working on at any given point in time.
Amazing. What are the challenges that you face within that fund? Is there any collaboration with governments? Because you can understand you can implement something within the private sector, but there could be some roadblocks, with government. But because of your experience in governments, you can then knock on the door and say, listen, this is how we shift industrialization within South Africa. And I think that is the big thing, is that if we want to make a change in South Africa, you have to have some sort of relationship with governments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this doesn't work if you don't have those kind of relationships. And I think it's a big part of what I do is spending time not only with the line ministry that I was in previously, which was Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, but speaking to National Treasury, the Department of Transport, the Department of Energy and Electricity, just so that everyone can see themselves as agents of industrial policy and industrialization in South Africa. And it's something, a lot of people will turn to government and turn to a department and say, solve all of my problems. But what you realize is that the tools to solve these problems are scattered or at least allocated across different ministries, different departments, sometimes within the presidency. And so we try to build networks and relations with as many government departments as we can so that we can socialize the challenges, socialize the opportunities as well, and try to build alignment. And how do you build alignment? First of all, there's a journey that you need to take people through as to why this is important and what has changed that we can now solve the problem. because there's
I
no
think what the impact of that change would
exactly
mean to
exactly
the greater country.
yeah
And I think that's what it is. It's like, if you had to change this in the manufacturing space, how would it actually impact on, you know, the smaller community? And that for me is the big thing.
It's such an important thing, and you see it with so many of the companies that we speak to. When you ask them, you know, where do your employees come from, and they'll often say, well, actually they come from 2 or 3 communities that would typically be sort of underserved in many other respects, where they will be the main provider of food and security to this. And so it's incredibly important. I mean, you know, you asked what are some of the big challenges. I think obviously we're dealing with, you know, South Africa is the world is in a place of uncertainty at the moment. You know, I don't know if you've ever looked at the doomsday clock or familiar with it, but you know, there's a sort of measure of how close we are to disaster, and we're the closest we've ever been over the history of the doomsday clock, closer than we were during any period in the Cold War. And so it speaks to global uncertainty. We have so many of the industrial policy measures and global collaboration measures that we've taken for granted of this post-World War II period are being re-looked at. I mean, you just look at the tariff increases that the United States are trying to push through. This is very, very different. It's a new kind of way of thinking. We had COVID and we still grappling with what that means to our economy. And so in so many different ways, the South African economy is coming under pressure, coming under stress. And so one of the big challenges we face is, how do we support businesses that are in distress? What is our role? And it's one that we kind of grapple with quite a lot. I mean, again, we would love to be everything to everyone, but we can't be. And so we've got to be very focused on what is within our mandate and our capability to influence and change, and where can't we do something, and where we have to just say, look, for better or for worse, we'll have to park this for now, but focus on the things that we can do something about.
Do you have any, like, a specific success story that you'd share with me? You know, that you got involved in and you're like, you know what, that made a change to that family's life or that specific business?
Look, there've been a couple that I'm really proud of. So one is, as I mentioned, there's a multinational FMCG, and I'm under, unfortunately, NDA, so I can't disclose who it is. But they had approached us sort of mid last year and said they really wanted to localize a particular chemical compound that goes into their detergents and other type of goods that you find on the shelves in South Africa. And while they were blending a lot of these goods in South Africa, they were still importing the raw materials. And so they came to us and said, look, they'd identified a particular manufacturer that they think had the wherewithal to provide for them, but they had to go through a bit of a technical journey. And so we sat with them, we did the needs analysis, we then established that what they really needed was a chemical process engineer that could come in with them, do all the testing, figure out all the kinks in the process, because ultimately whatever got produced would have to go to the HQ globally to get approved. And so there were very stringent criteria, because obviously we're dealing with a good that the public are going to consume at the end of the day. And, you know, all of the various safety and other, elements had to be met. And within 4 months, we were able to get them to a point where not only had they met quality, not only had they met specifications, but they came in 10% cheaper than what was previously being imported. And that same multinational FMCG has said to us, the quality and the price is so good that we can actually start exporting from South Africa. We were importing that good completely. And I mean, that's led to a doubling of employment in that particular facility.
The amounts of jobs that
absolutely. And
phenomenal.
Really, it is. And look, like I say, every single job counts, because the moment you can create one manufacturing job, you crowd in all of these ancillary jobs up and down the value chain, in ancillary manufacturing industries. So that was really not only sort of heartwarming, but a kind of a big indication of what we can do. And, you know, there were a couple of other policy objectives that we were able to meet at the same time. One, the raw material for that chemical compound is mined in South Africa. But the typical African storyline, we export the unrefined product, we import, exactly. So this leads to what's referred to as beneficiation, this ability to turn our raw materials into a higher value good in South Africa. And secondly, it was a Black-owned supplier, and so it satisfies some of the transformation objectives that we want to go through as well. And
ticked all the boxes.
Exactly. And so from that point of view, what we showed was localization can work.
Yeah.
It makes commercial sense, and it can also address a number of other competitive opportunities. And, one of the things that we've been quite focused on saying is that, often some of the critics of localization as a strategy will often say, well, hang on, the South African market's only so small. Surely we should be focusing on exports. And what I say to that is it's a false dichotomy to say that it's localization or exports. It's localization as a tool towards building the economies of scale, building the innovation and the know-how and the competitiveness that it can allow us to be export effective and competitive. And if you look at most industries around the world, not in South Africa, they've gone through a period of incubation locally, if I can put it that way, where because local demand can be leveraged in some shape or form, you build that know-how, you build that technical competence that allows you to be export competitive. And I think that's ultimately where we're going to build it. We're not going to be able to localize everything in South Africa.
Yeah.
I know that, and everyone else knows that.
But where you can,
make
sure you
absolutely,
you capitalize on that.
Exactly. And I think that's what we're doing. And so I would certainly welcome any manufacturer to reach out to us. Industry associations we work with quite closely. And like I say, we do everything from that front-end research to business case development, to the technical support, advocacy. It's everything that we think is required in South Africa, and real kind of hands-on project management and execution. Because one of the reasons why a standalone unit was established is that we recognize that if we're really going to get this going, we need someone who can sort of roll in the sleeves, get themselves dirty, understand the issues. And so what I've really enjoyed about this role is that it allows me to bring together a lot of the different elements of my career. If I go back to the schooling I had in finance and understanding how capital markets move, it allows me to speak a language to businesses that they understand. I can speak EBITDA, I can speak margins, I can speak inventory management and working capital and understand their challenges. But when we speak to government, I can understand what the work, the public policy opportunity is and where the challenges might be. And it's trying to find where the Venn diagram of public policy and commercial reality overlap. And that's really that space that we're trying to play in as much as possible.
I'm definitely going to need to send some of my clients your way.
Yeah.
But I think on that note, thank you so much for having the conversation with me. An incredible mind. I think you've achieved so much in your young life. I wish you all the best with this fund. I think it leads to incredible opportunities, even on the employment front. But I really appreciate your time and thank you, Irshaad.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really great to chat to you.
Thank you.